Thank you very much, Richard. I'm pleased to say that the Right Honourable Simon Hughes has come to speak to us as well. Simon has been very vocal and active on the Cyprus issue in the past, and if we can describe him as a critical friend of Turkey at present as well. So, thank you, Simon. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll stand here, if I may. Chair, with apologies to you and colleagues, this will be a brief contribution now, then I'll go off and do some media and then I'll come back, so I apologise. You may have noticed it's been a slightly frenetic day on subjects European, and that's involved me. I was very happy to listen to what Richard said, because I don't think I disagree with any of the substantive points, Richard, which you made, and made obviously in a very topical way from your perspective, chairing the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I just want to add three thoughts, really. Not as an overly critical friend at all, but somebody who is privileged to represent a large number of Turkish and Turkish Cypriot people in my part of London, and has noticed in the last 25 years the growth of and influence of the Turkish community in London and in Britain. And I've just come from a meeting now with Vince Cable, the Business Secretary, and one of the things I was talking to him about was the follow-on, A, from the presidential visit here, and B, from his visit to Turkey, to explore what the opportunities were to develop things there. And the answer, put very simply, is that we hugely underexploit the opportunities of that link. Vince was very clear that the amount of trade we do bears no comparison at all to the amount of trade we could do. That the interest and the energy and the desire to have far more engagement far exceeds what is actually happening on the ground at the moment. And one example, for example, in addition to the business activity, would be in the world of academia, of students, of undergraduates, of postgraduates, of people who are teaching and lecturing and so on, of science exchange, of technology exchange. There is a fantastic opportunity because now people realise that Turkey is a serious and significant player, both in Europe, but also as a bridge between Europe and Asia. So the perception here in this place, and I'll just tell you as I find it, from when I first came here 28 years ago to now, is that countries like Turkey, Brazil and Latin America have moved up, if you're talking football analogies, from the third or second division to the championship, and the way they're going, they will be knocking on the door of the Premiership before too long. So that's the perspective. That, of course, has a huge impact on Cyprus and issues to do with Cyprus. Because one of the perceptions before was that everything to do with Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was determined by the generals. There was no democratic participation in that. And it was just going to be an absolutist, what we have, we hold approach. We have come in, this is our territory, we're not going to move unless there is a significant accommodation of the Turkish community as opposed to the Turkish Cypriot community in Cyprus. Second point to make is the one that Richard made. It is still the perception in this country and elsewhere that there needs to be a lot of further improvements in the freedom of speech and freedom of expression and human rights. So that's very important. It's nothing to do with secularism and Islamization. It's nothing to do with the Ataturk legacy. It's to do with, on the ground, what people are able to do and to be and how they're able to live their lives. And of course, there are difficult political issues like the Kurdish issue. But it's not even only to do with regional identity and sub-regional identity. It's to do with letting that more democratic society grow. And for the Commonwealth, and for Cyprus, and for the UK as a guarantor power in relation to Cyprus, and for the Cypriot community, and for the Greek Cypriot community, that's still a very important issue on the agenda. But the third thing that Richard didn't say, not because I don't think he disagrees with it, I would hope, but which I hope I can add. One of the frustrations as somebody who has wanted a solution to the Cyprus problem, I wanted a restoration of proper independence to the whole of Cyprus, working for both communities in Cyprus all the time, has been that it's never actually been at the top of anybody's agenda. Cyprus is a small country. Yes, it's part of the European Union, and the opportunity to sort it before it joined the European Union came and then went. Yes, it's part of the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth hasn't really said this is something important. Yes, there have been special representatives sent in periodically by the United Nations. Yes, there have been endless talks under different presidents and different prime ministers on both sides of the border. But the European community and the Mediterranean community have never said, we've really got to make some progress here. There's never been much pressure from around the Mediterranean. And it requires pressure for it to be resolved. It requires pressure, it seems to me, from the other Mediterranean states, because Cyprus too has much greater potential than it currently has if it could be united. It's the only blot on the European Union landscape in terms of divided territory. And if we can't sort out our own internal issues, how can we go around the world trying to sell conflict resolution and conflict issues being dealt with in a better way if we can't do them at home? And so my one belief is that we need to make sure that, although historically Cyprus isn't an issue for other countries because of our common history, unlike the UK, and although it's not seen to be a big country which will make a big difference to people's trade and immigration and so on, nonetheless we need allies to work with us. We haven't managed to do it on our own. Turkey and Greece and the UK have not managed, with the government and the people of Cyprus, over now very nearly 40 years to sort out the Cypriot issue. And therefore, if there is to be progress, Turkey is making progress, needs to do better on human rights. We need, however, to have more allies as seeing this as an issue that needs to be resolved. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's one of those conflicts that the further we go, the more sterile and more stuck it gets, paradoxically. I think it is possible to see movement that suggests that people are still willing to work for a solution. But it's not going to be resolved just by people on the island. They've got to take the lead, they've got to take the initiative, but they need to feel a bit of pressure from behind them and around them. Not aggressively, not destructively, not overly critically, but constructively saying, come on guys, the potential of Cyprus is hugely greater for all the communities if you could resolve this, and the potential for the Mediterranean is hugely greater. Chair, if I can leave us at that for the moment, go and do what I have to do across the road and then come and join you for a little time in the discussion later. And it's really good that you're here. And I noticed on the front of the programme you have Tower Bridge, which half of which is in my constituency, as your symbol for the Centre for Turkish Studies. You are wise people, clearly. You understand the need for bridges, and bridges that work successfully like that. And this community, this conversation is a bridge that is working successfully. It has a bit more using the engineering to get it working more frequently and successfully to do.
I can see the debate at the moment is on immigration, so I don't know, Richard, if you want to nip in and say, look, get rid of the visas for Turkey while they're discussing it in the House of Commons. Our last but one speaker is Dr. Bill Kasey, who will be speaking from an academic perspective, I believe, with Turkey and democracy. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much to Ibrahim for inviting me to speak to this meeting. I'm not primarily an expert on Turkey, although I have some background in the area. I do teach democratization as a general topic, and when I came here I said I'd speak in very general terms about the meaning of democratization in Turkey. But when I consider this particular issue, I kind of concluded that democratization in Turkey could mean about 25 or 30 different things. And even from an academic perspective, if we wanted to define what democratization actually means, we could only say it's political development that is generally very positive. If you want to say what it means in a concrete sense, this is very, very difficult. And for all the reasons that Ali has mentioned, when it comes to Turkey, we cannot assume that models or processes of democratization which have succeeded elsewhere will also succeed in Turkey. So I'm going to begin my presentation by saying I'm not going to talk about democratization. I'm going to talk about the connection between democratization and constitution making. And I think constitution making is a safer bet really for someone like me, because like the EU accession process, it anchors what is a very multi-dimensional discourse about political change in Turkey, which is quite recent and also quite unprecedented, I think, in the context of Turkey's history. It anchors it in something that is far more concrete. And I think maybe in 10 years' time, when we want to assess what has happened in terms of democratization in Turkey, we will look retrospectively at the constitution-making process and try and assess the extent to which it fulfilled whatever hopes there were in this particular process. Now, one reason I like the topic of constitutions too is because the empirical evidence that you need a working, legitimate constitution to have a democracy is almost overwhelming at this stage. We are existing or living in a country without a codified constitution, which in today's world is very, very rare. I mean, if we were to take the top 35 performing democracies in the world, all but 2 have a written constitution. If we were to consider the Southern European and Eastern and Central European countries that have had a successful transition to democracy, I suppose since the 1970s, again, practically all of them have adopted a constitution as part of this process. And if we were to consider it globally, it's not necessarily a European thing. There are now almost 200 written constitutions in the world, 50% of which have been adopted in the last 45 years. So Turkey is by no means an exception in seeing this particular constitutional moment as a means of furthering the process of democratization. Now, I'm aware of the fact that Turkey has already had 3 or 4 distinct constitutions. Some of them have been more successful than the others. But at the moment, there are 2 elements which are different. One is the fact that this constitution uniquely is going to be produced in a process dominated by civilian and not military or authoritarian leaders. And secondly, although there is inevitably a dominant party pushing this change, on the surface the process is consensual in a way that the process was never really before. So there's reason for some optimism. Now, you could go around the world to different countries and find a lot about different countries' political culture by asking people on the ground, is your constitution important to you? I'm sure if you go to the United States, you will get the biggest positive response. As far as I know, in the United States, it's the only country in the world that actually has a museum in Philadelphia to the making of its constitution in the late 18th century. Americans assume that their constitution is the bedrock of citizenship, national identity, and also democracy. But they are not necessarily representative. I've spent most of my academic career writing about Ireland. And when Ireland became independent, very much like Turkey, the assumption was if we're going to be independent, we have to mark our independence with the passing of a constitution. But after about 5 years, the leader of the opposition party said, who attaches importance to this constitution? It's only the small Labour Party that has no power and whose desire is to be respectable in all things that attaches any importance to the constitution. For us, it's nothing but a piece of paper. when this man later came to power and basically took over the Irish state, he changed his view and he imposed his own constitution against great opposition, basically knowing that the constitution not only reflected a shift in the balance of power towards its own party, but also that it symbolised its entrenchment in the institutions of the state in a way that was not possible when the state was founded. Now, I find it very interesting when I speak to Turkish people about this particular constitution-making process. I cannot find many people who are like the Americans. I find a lot more people who are a little bit more like the Irish. Now, I'm not saying that it's a national syndrome that the Americans are by definition more idealistic than we are. Why would I? But I am saying that this is very much an issue at stake in Turkey. What is this constitution-making process about? If you take a cynical interpretation of what is happening, that generally there is a process by which a dominant party is entrenching itself in power, and it has the electoral strength to further entrench itself in power. And regardless of what happens in this particular consensual process, it's going to pose a question which is here in Britain, which is there in Ireland, and which is there in many countries, of how you reconcile constitutionalism to political dominance. And this is something I think that for me is a really crucial issue, because it applies not only to the process of making a constitution, which may be consensual, but it applies also to how this constitution is going to work once this dramatic period of constitutional making has passed. So down the road, it's a crucial issue. I don't find very much emphasis in what I read about Turkey on specifically institutional issues when we're considering this particular constitution-making process. It seems to me that the need for this process is to produce a system of checks and balances which will make Turkish democracy work for everyone in the long term. That, for me, is the most concrete outcome that is to be desired. Now, why isn't that the subject of what I read? It's obvious from what Alan has said that this particular turning point in Turkey is also about coming to terms with the past. And constitutions in many countries have served the role of what they call new beginnings. New beginnings in the sense that new institutions are established that will guide the development of Turkish democratic practices, but also a new beginning in the sense that something in the past is renounced and some new set of values is embraced. So therefore, there is an institutional and a symbolic new beginning. And I think this is a very important thing, because when we look at other cases, we can see different ways in which this dual process, the institutional and the symbolical new beginning, is addressed. If, for example, we look at Spain and its constitution in 1978, the emphasis was on an elite agreement, consensus among the elites, downplaying the degree of change, and burying historical discussion for a generation. Democracy, constitutionalism were reconciled at the expense of historical memory. If we look at, let's say, Northern Ireland and its peace agreement in 1998, what happened there was a very elaborate, inclusive, consensual process that produced an extraordinarily complex set of institutions. And 15 years down the line, if we ask, is this compromise stable? Is it fragile? It certainly is stable in the sense that there is no possibility of return to large-scale violence. But if we ask, is it fragile? Well, I think it is fragile in the sense that if reconciliation means community relations, coming to terms with the past, justice for victims, and all of these things, inevitably it is fragile, and it's a long-term job to complete this process. So I think when it comes to Turkey, as in any constitution-making process, we have to ask the question, do we raise expectations or do we depress expectations? To me, it's going to be very difficult to achieve an institutional compromise and at the same time reconcile in terms of the Kurdish issue, religious minorities, the whole legacy of authoritarianism, state violence, and so forth. This doesn't mean it shouldn't take place. It's going to take a lot of time. Now, as an academic, I often wonder what role we should have when it comes to advising or commenting on what politicians have to do in practical terms. And I'm only going to end my presentation by throwing out 3 observations. One, I went to a conference in the LSE where 4 Turkish academics and 1 British legal expert were debating the new constitutional process. And it struck me that what they were doing was applying very normative standards about civil society, participation, consensus, unanimity, and so forth to this particular process. And they were selecting from a range of Western European cases what Turkey could do in practical terms to address its historically specific problems. And at the end of this particular session, a very senior constitutional lawyer, I think from Germany, stood up and said, well, you know, it's very inspiring, but at the end of the day, Turkey is a very specific place. For the reasons we've heard, it has a specific history, and also it's at the confluence, geographically, of a set of cultural, religious influences that is relatively unique. And if the constitutional process is to succeed, and if Turkey is going to be in a position where it can benefit from all the things that are there in terms of other democratic constitutions, it must establish something indigenous that is peculiar to Turkey as part of its constitution. And he threw that out to the speakers, and I don't think there was really an answer to that. But it seems to me a pretty fundamental issue. The second thing is, when it comes to consensus and the possibility that consensus can produce compromise and a legitimate constitution, I think we have to recognize that on all these issues, whether it's Kurdish rights, whether it's religious minorities, whether it's secularism, whether it's the army or so forth, it's not like people coming together and agreeing how to prevent natural disasters in Turkey. These issues are inherently political. They are inherently conflictual. And it will be a massive achievement if, in the course of the next year and a half, reconciliation as well as a constitutional compromise is achieved on all of them. Lastly, in terms of democracy, I've only once done a research project in Turkey, and it was basically asking the question, what do people mean by democracy in Turkey? And what do they mean by democratization? And what do they mean by all of these concepts like human rights, civil society, democratic autonomy that have become part of political discourse in Turkey? The only thing I could conclude that the Turks, particularly the elites, meant by democracy reaching kind of Western standards. And if this has been true since, let's say, the 1950s onwards, there has been a consistency, and one would expect political reform to go in a certain direction. But now, of course, we're in new territory, because Turkey is perhaps being rejected by the EU. Perhaps the EU will not exist in the same form in 5 years' time. And there's a whole arena of democratization taking place on its borders. In this context, Turkey will move from being a classic southern European country that has been on the receiving end of models of economic development and democratic development passively to perhaps being a promoter of democracy in that region. I think it's already happening irrevocably. But does this imply then that this notion of democracy which has existed until now, which implies convergence at different levels with Western societies, does this imply then that the concept of democracy will itself change? And if it does, of course, what does this imply for those countries that are looking at Turkey and saying, well, you know, this country is economically dynamic, it's got a moderate Islamic government, for a long time the military and the requirements of constitutionalism led to some kind of a standoff, and of course it hasn't sold out its sovereignty to the European Union, which is also an important fact there. So what does it imply for how Turkey will be seen in this region as a democratic country? What is it about Turkey that would make it a democratic model? Perhaps they won't see it as a model once they get to know it, or perhaps they will identify a mix of elements which they in turn would recognize as an indigenous viable model for themselves.
Being somewhere that was aspiring for democracy.
Mr. Chair, we had a question for Mr. Trevi. Unfortunately, he has to go.
I know. I think some of them are going to try and come back later, so towards the end. We will have a question and answer session after the last speaker, and this topic is going back to what future for Cyprus, and then we'll have the, as I said, the question and answers then. So.
May I also thank Ibrahim for giving me this opportunity, and really it's a privilege to sit here with all distinguished guests and try to contribute to this debate. I'm from Cyprus, and I've talked mainly Cyprus and its links with what's going on in Turkey, because whatever happens in Turkey affects us directly in Cyprus. You may say in particular the Turkish Cypriots or the Turkish side of Cyprus. In fact, it affects the whole of Cyprus and the future of Cyprus. Now, some of us may be quite happy and concerned with the fact that Cyprus is a member of the European Union, so its future is somehow determined. It is extremely difficult and unimaginative at this stage to think that the Cyprus will just pull out or kick out of the European Union. I was just listening to Simon before he left, and he just mentioned about Turkey being coming up a strong country and the big player in the world, and Cyprus, of course, being such a little country and perhaps not receiving the necessary attention from the rest of the world or from the Mediterranean countries. I would say, because that's one important thing, is that in the world, if you believe in values like democracy, freedom, human rights, etc., all those values are not really distributed amongst according to their sizes. And we must be quite consistent on those principles. Turkey is a young democracy. Professor Samuel Huntington measures or proposes to measure the democracy, whether it exists or not, or whether it is consolidated in a country on the basis that in that country, the civilian government is elected through a constitutional democracy and on 2 consecutive terms without any intervention, mainly from the army. And this happened in Turkey only recently, and that has been achieved by today's government under AKP. So, looking at it from that point of view, and considering that the democracy in Turkey is so young, and in every country, not only in Turkey, but in every country, there are all different aspects to the democracy and democratization process. We have to look at the Turkish democratization process from that point of view. And from my point of view, where I will try to link this to the Cyprus, I will concentrate on the dimension of the democratization in Turkey, which is, to some extent, recently initiated by Turkish aspiration for accession to the European membership. And what is going on, what is we are observing in Turkey today, is the democratization process by the Turkish government in order to comply with the principles and rules of the European Union in order to achieve membership. This can Cyprus be welcome with open arms, and I will explain later why. And although this does not exclude the other aspects of the democratization process in Turkey, it is an important aspect. Because what bothers me when I look at the democratization process in Turkey is the fact that until 2004, there were 15 members in the European Union. By 2004, we had another 10 members, and later we have another 2. In total, 12 new EU members. All these members have gone through this process, and they have achieved this process without really any great problems. But in Turkey, this process, whichever aspect we look at, is on a bumpy ride. We look at it from the government's point of view, trying to harmonize with the European Union rules and principles, and there are problems there. We look at it from the democratization process of the civil society, including communities, ethnic minorities, religious groups, and all other sections within Turkey who are, I believe, fighting for their share in the democratization process in Turkey and changing in the constitution. And this apparently is a very important aspect of Turkish democracy, and I would like to quote a brief note from Noam Chomsky, who many people who have read about him, they know that he is quite critical about democracy in Western countries, in particular in the United States of America, and he blames in many of his articles the intelligentsia, the academics, the journalists, the writers, who siding together with their own governments or with those who have the power in hand, and not trying to contribute or help the civil society, the wider section of the people, to get their share from the democratic process. And he, in one of his articles, said that this is true for almost all Western democratic countries, with the exception of one country in the world, and said that country is Turkey. And he goes on to explain that in Turkey, the intelligentsia, the academicians, the journalists, the writers, are fighting on the side of the people rather than fighting or trying to consolidate what the government has been doing. And that, in my opinion, is perhaps the main reason why we have so many writers, journalists, etc. in prison today in Turkey. Now, I just wanted to mention that before I get on to Cyprus aspect of the topic. All these, as I said, affect us in Cyprus. But the most important one was the Turkey's accession to the European Union and the democratization process which goes with it. We know that in that process there are two problems, and both problems are linked back to Cyprus. One of them is that because of the Cyprus problem, Turkey does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus as a separate independent country. And in retaliation, you may say, the Cyprus vetoed Turkey's 8 chapters out of 32 of being open, discussed and closed. So this democratization process cannot go ahead without Cyprus lifting the veto. And for Cyprus to lift the veto means that Turkey has to recognize Cyprus as a country, which means, or brings us back to the solution of the Cyprus problem, because it is highly unlikely that without a solution to the Cyprus problem, Turkey is going to recognize Cyprus as an independent country. The other problem, which again is caused, or the cause is linked back to the Cyprus, is the problems between, not between actually, the problems caused for NATO in NATO's relations with the European Union. Now, I don't know, but if you know, Cyprus is the only European Union member who has not signed Partnership for Peace with NATO. Because of that, Cyprus cannot take place and attend to any meetings which take place between NATO and the European Union. This is an impediment for NATO, especially in their operations, what they call the peace operations, in Afghanistan. The reason behind that, there are two. One is because of the present situation and the fact that the president of the Republic of Cyprus is a communist, and he wouldn't sign the agreement with NATO. Once when he was in Moscow, he said, "Where am I, dead body?" And he wouldn't become, or he wouldn't allow Cyprus, as long as he is the president, to become a member of NATO. But the other side of the coin is, even if Cyprus has decided to sign this agreement or partnership for peace, or even to become a member of the NATO, then Cyprus cannot do it, because Turkey will veto it. Now, it is a situation where you cannot win. And again, all this is going on because of Turkey's non-recognition of this Cyprus as a republic, as a country. And then this is now extended, and because Cyprus is becoming the rotating president of the European Union as from July next year, then it is now coming into a situation where, as if Turkey is not recognizing the rotating president of the European Union. And European Union is the destiny of Turkey that is determined by Turkey. So, with all these taken into consideration, and when we look at the democratization process in Turkey from the angle of that democratization process is being channeled towards Turkey's membership to the European Union, it seems to me that this democratic procession is extremely important. Extremely important in relation to and when linked to the solution of the Cyprus problem. Now, with that going on, of course, we have another problem for Turkey, where we may talk about the constitution, or we may talk about the national policies rectified in the parliaments in Turkey, with the Grand National Assembly. Now, Turkey, or Turkish National Assembly, in 1999 has rectified a national policy on Cyprus. That national policy was based on a declaration prepared and signed by the then President Demirel and current President Denktaş. In that policy, which is a national policy, it says that, in a nutshell, that Turkey will continue to support the TRNC, its existence, but more importantly, it says that the membership of Cyprus to the European Union as a whole must be simultaneously with Turkey's accession to Turkey. Now, considering that this was a national policy, whatever government comes into cannot really change it and is duty-bound to work within that policy. I do remember myself in the beginning of January 2003, when today's President Abdullah was Prime Minister, and then he prepared two alternative paragraphs, very short paragraphs, to present to the Assembly to change this national policy of Turkey, because that policy simply meant no solution is the solution. You can't get anywhere. But Abdullah Gül at the time, just being Prime Minister for a month or so, couldn't even succeed to get his proposal to the agenda of the Grand Assembly. And it never changed. It is still in use. And today's government in Turkey, AKP, has to, being duty-bound, to operate within that policy. I cannot blame AKP for that, but what I can criticize AKP for, looking at it now, Erdogan is the strongest, historically, the strongest Prime Minister Turkey has seen for a while. And we can see it in the last year's referendum, how he can easily manage to carry out changes to the constitution of Turkey. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. But it shows his strength. And I believe with that strength in hand, Erdogan must be able and must be capable of reviewing Turkish national policy on Cyprus and try to update it and align it with the democratic or democratization process in Turkey, all channeled to European Union. Because the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, both countries, Turkey and Cyprus, are destined to unite in the European Union. And if you look at the whole problem from that angle, I believe it would be for the benefit of all, and also for the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, if Turkish democratization process, which is underway, goes so far to embrace a democratic approach to Cyprus problem and try to resolve that as well, not leaving it to the last minute when the time will come for Turkey to become a member of the European Union and then face all other political problems there. I'm saying all that, but of course, looking at the recent events and political changes in the European Union. What has happened in Greece and what has happened in Italy raises very serious questions about the value of the democracy in the Western countries. And we must not forget that because of the financial crisis, the democratically elected prime ministers and governments of those countries have been asked to aside and let others who are not elected to come in and run the countries. So if that is the democracy in the Western countries and in the European Union where Turkey is going to, I believe Turkey also keep her eyes open and look at the prospects of the future, as I hope Turkey will never face the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Some very good points made by the panel members. Is Turkey a beacon of democracy now for the Middle East? Or is it on itself on the way to democratisation? Can the EU or trade with the EU be a catalyst for Turkey to go forward? What role can we play, the people outside Turkey? And what will happen with Cyprus in the future? It's not certain. What I will do now is open for some question and answer sessions. If I could ask you to keep it brief, not give us a lecture, and if you could give us your name, if you represent an organisation, that organisation, and to whom the question is directed to. So, start with you, and then...
My name is Alp Mehmet, Alper Mehmet, depending which language you're speaking. I declare an interest. I was born in Cyprus, I've grown up here. I have land which is in the south, and I have relations who disappeared in December 1963.
So your question as well, please.
This is relevant, sorry. My first bit of my question is, how do we get around, despite the progress that has been made in Turkey, as Mr. Rossaway perceptibly pointed out, how do we get around the fact that Germany, France, Austria and a number of other countries have said they don't want Turkey in the European Union? How will we get around that, despite of any progress that may be made? Secondly, with regard to Cyprus, why should, and this is a question for everyone, why should Greek Cyprus actually make any concessions at all? They have achieved everything so far without having to make any concessions. Why should they allow me to take my infirm, aged mother direct to Cyprus? Why should they agree for Cyprus, Turkish Cyprus, to trade with the outside world in the way envisaged by the Annan Plan? Why should they compromise in the way that...
I think we made your point on why should they.
In the way that Mr. Simon Hughes said. And I say all that loving Greek Cypriots and having a lot of close Greek Cypriot friends.
Right, the first question was obviously France, Germany, Austria, and a number of other countries don't wish to see Turkey in the European Union. So what chance does Turkey have to get into the European Union? Dr. Ali, do you have any thoughts on that?
Tabii şimdi görünür olarak böyle bir soru sorduğunuz zaman çok şansı yok. Ama Avrupa Birliği meselesi Türkiye'de aynı zamanda konjonktürel bir mesele olarak görülür. Türkiye'nin Avrupa Birliği ilişkileri temel olarak iki temel nedene dayanıyor. Bunlardan bir tanesi Batı piyasalarından büyük ekonomik oradaki lokalizasyondan kopma. İkincisi de kendi iç dönüşümünü, iç değişimini Avrupa Birliği etkileşimi içerisinde gerçekleştiriyor. Bu iki unsur Avrupa Birliği yani Batı ve Batılılaşma fikri üstünden Türkiye'de hala varlığını sürdürüyor. Somut olarak Almanya ve Fransa'nın Türkiye'yi engellemesi mümkün ama